Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Porter Anderson, Editor-in-Chief at Publishing Perspectives, and I'm joined today for our program From Author to Bookshop about the coronavirus on world publishing by three terrific speakers I'm glad to have with us. Hugo Setzer is the president of the International Publishers Association, which is based in Geneva. Hugo is in Mexico. John Deegan, speaking to us from Canada, is chair of the International Authors Forum. And also with us is Fabian Pagman, the co-president of the European and International Booksellers Federation. Welcome to you all. Thank you for coming. As we get started, because of course we're talking about the very important and necessary topic about what's happening to our industry. I also would just like to check very quickly, journalist that I am, with the latest figures coming to us from the Worldometer system, which is also used by the Johns Hopkins tracking system, to note that at this point, the world total is 7,476,188 cases of the coronavirus COVID-19 in the world, and the death toll for the world is 419,361 people. What this reminds us of course, is the fact that the role of literature, the role of so much of what our publishers do, our authors do, and our booksellers do, is communicate to the world the sheer gravity of what we're going through, as well as the many ways we try to help them deal with coping with it and learn more about it and respond to it as the most intelligent way possible. But we must never forget that we're looking at an enormous level of fatality and suffering on a planetary scale. And I think this makes the urgency of our conversation today as to what shape this industry is in order to make the best response it can to the pandemic, all the more important. The final note here being that we must not ever think at this time in the experience we're going through that we're done yet. Unfortunately, too many people are eager and very understandably to say it's all over, the problem is done, we're coming back out now. Unfortunately, we think there is a lot farther to go. We have not even a therapeutic response, let alone a vaccine yet. So with that note in mind, the importance and the gravity of what publishing is trying to respond to really comes to the fore. And Hugo, if you'll start us off with your purview of the many nations, some 69 nations, I believe, are member publishing associations of the International Publishers Association. Can you tell us from what your associations are saying, what is the biggest stumbling block that the publishers are looking at right now at this stage in our experience of the pandemic?
Thank you, Porter. It's an honor for me to be in this panel, joining you. Thank you for moderating this discussion, Porter. And I agree with you on the importance of having right now this discussion with our main partners in the book chain, with authors and with booksellers. One of the things is that well, there are a lot of things happening, like delayed book releases, collapsed revenues. We have had canceled industry events which have impacted our industry, like for example our International Publishers Congress, which was supposed to take place in May in Lillehammer, where publishers from all around the world should have come together to meet and discuss around the main themes we are concerned nowadays, and that has had to be canceled. And as you mentioned, and I was going to say as well, you're right, we have 69 countries, we have 83 associations as members of IPA coming from 69 countries, and every one of those 83 associations has in turn a lot of individual publishers. So through them we represent thousands of publishers around the world. So and not only our Congress was canceled, but so many book fairs, which is really the place where we can meet and we can discuss things. We meet with our authors, we meet also with booksellers, we meet with readers, and those have been mostly, unfortunately, canceled. So those are some of the main challenges we're facing.
It's an extraordinary structural bump, isn't it? Because so many of the ways we normally work, not only with our partners as authors and as booksellers and distribution vendors, but how we work with each other, how publishers actually talk and move, as you're saying, in our various gatherings around the world. All of that is suddenly on hiatus and for an indefinite amount of time, which introduces another uncertainty and another sense of a very difficult murk to the entire situation. It's quite unique. In many ways, we're glad it's unique, but it's devastating at times to contemplate and to wonder how difficult this will become before it's over.
Absolutely.
Hugo, let's move if we can, John, to look at authors next, because we've gone, if you will, from the publishers who actually present the work to the people who bring it to us, the very bedrock of the industry, the creative engine that our author community, the author core creates for us. And in many ways, I think the authors are the most vulnerable in the entire supply chain because they are individual operatives. And just taking it from all sides, as we each are as individuals, but their entire brand lives within their own work. Tell us what you see as the most critical feature of impact the authors seem to be feeling at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Porter. I think, you know, everything that Hugo was talking about, the publishing schedules disrupted and authors who had books ready for launch in the spring, having those launches put off or canceled altogether, or having to scramble to try to do an online launch, and whether or not that's as effective in terms of sales as an in-person launch. All of those things, but I think a hidden impact that doesn't get talked about an awful lot, and you really put it into perspective there at the beginning. I mean, we are in the middle of a global health crisis, and there's this sort of funny meme or trend out there on social media that you know, authors are natural introverts, and so being locked down in our homes, this is a perfect opportunity to work on a book and all of that kind of stuff. But it ignores the fact that that authors are now, you know, taking care of kids who aren't in school, taking care of elderly parents who are incredibly vulnerable. And so, in fact, I would say productivity is probably way down for authors who are used to having that work time to themselves. And it's caused a real problem. I know that I heard on NPR the other day that literary agents are seeing a spike in submissions, but the submissions seem to be sort of instant books that were written during the lockdown. And so, you know, I mean, we'll see how far that goes. The author who's been working on a book for 2-3 years and suddenly the lockdown comes, I think there's been a real level of disruption there, and we're not going to see the impact of that for, you know, months down the road or another year at least.
I think you're touching on something so important, and it's a fascinating part, of course, of the industry for our creative process. I've heard it called the myth of genius in lockdown, that everyone thinks, the mad genius is now up in the attic, you know, beautifully putting out the next masterpiece. What I was just speaking earlier today to an author in Sweden, very fine writer, who was saying that he's finding he can't work just because of the anxiety of the situation. He and his wife don't have children, and so they don't have that difficulty. And they both are accustomed to being at home to work. But when he sits down, he can't focus. He's worried about all of the ramifying elements of the danger of the contagion.
Right. And early on, social media told that person that if he was William Shakespeare, he'd be writing King Lear right now. You know what I mean? So there's this immense pressure as well that comes with this weird time that we're living in.
There is. You're right. It's a wonderful point, and it's something we need to remember, because there is a human level at which we need to actually be enabling and responding and supporting our authors that probably doesn't impact the rest of us as business people in the same way. Far beyond, speaking of vulnerable elements of the supply chain, I think we all look at the bookstores as the most endangered, if you will, the most susceptible to the calamities, economically speaking, of what's happening. Not because they're independent necessarily. The scrappiness has been exciting when we've seen people who are making their own deliveries and doing curbside delivery to people. We've seen this wonderfully in the United States. A real, who was one of our NPD folks was saying they fought it tooth and nail, that the bookstores have really not given up and have continued to work as best they can. But what do you see as the biggest impact on the book selling sector? It's got to be enormous.
Yeah, well, thank you, Porter. What we've seen, obviously, is that because we are on the end line, on the forefront, depending on the way you look at it, where we are directly impacted and affected by the change in consumer behavior and reader behavior, which was, overnight happening once the lockdowns were implemented in the several countries. And as it spread through the world, booksellers experienced that immediately. And that the differences are enormous. I mean, you mentioned in your introduction incredible numbers of casualties that we have worldwide, but if you look at it per country, it varies a lot. And not only that, also the government regulations are very different. We have quite a number of countries with complete lockdowns, or areas of countries with complete lockdowns, or only limited lockdowns, and this is affecting the booksellers in ways they have ever experienced before. All of a sudden, they have to not only be innovative and think of new business models, but also have to deal with, how do you respect this 6 feet apart way of serving your customers in a totally different way that you're always used to, and that is actually in your DNA. So that brings about whole new challenges. Well, as I said, varying from, okay, how do I stay alive without being able to sell one book, from, okay, I'm able to keep my store open, but with all these restrictions and everything. So it is really a very complicated situation where, to a certain extent, we learn as we go. To take a positive note, it is driving the entrepreneurship of many booksellers, and we see a great number of new initiatives. And we like to think, as the IDF, we like to think that booksellers are in general very innovative people who are very open to new developments, and yeah, we see that in a lot of our members organizations happening right now as well.
It's a fascinating point you're making about innovation. One of the photos I love that has come out of the Brooklyn area of New York during the pandemic has been a shot of a young woman on the phone, and she's standing outside a bookstore looking through the window at the bookseller who's holding up the book to her to make sure. And she's talking to him by phone and saying, yes, and I also need this and this and this. And what he will do then, of course, is hand them out the door. She will pick them up and put the money in the door and go away. So innovation, yes, there have been marvelous moments like that. And it's quite heartwarming at times to see it's turning up, saying, how can I still buy a book?
Yeah, I must say, I would like to add to that we've also in general seen a huge sense of empathy also from readers and consumers, making huge efforts and being really, really willing to somehow find ways and reach out to especially those independent or closed down bookstores. And not only by the example you just gave, but also we see online, also especially those brick and mortar stores benefiting immensely from the shift from offline sales to online sales that is happening right now. And one of the hopes that we have is that we can we can keep that the willingness of the public to find their ways to the independent and brick and mortar stores.
Yeah, no, this is the key. Do you have any sense for how many layoffs are occurring? Is there a great deal of loss of jobs? Because without any kind of income, a bookseller, the owner of a bookstore, is unable to pay the staff for very long. Do we know if we're losing a great many jobs yet on the world scale, or can we tell you that?
What we see right now is that, except from the US is a different situation, but especially in Europe and also Australia and New Zealand, we see at this moment very little layoffs and also hardly any closing of stores. We've seen a large chain in Denmark that has to close down, unfortunately, but besides from that, right now things are, I would say, so far so good. And this is mainly because many governments, in especially those Western countries, have all sorts of support programs going on right now to support the entrepreneurs, to compensate some of the salaries for employees, for staff. So that automatically brings us to the worry that we have that we might actually face later this year or maybe in 2021 the actual effects that are resulting from, well, maybe not so much the health crisis, but the economic crisis that is expected to follow up on this health crisis.
Yeah, you're right. This is the fear.
It kind of looks like a delayed effect across the board, really, when you think about it.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And as Hugo was telling us, one of the big effects, it has to do with delayed releases too, and that when we get to the autumn, assuming that there is a less restrictive governmental structure in place for actual mitigation of transmission, and we think there's more commercial movement going on, so many books that have been delayed from the spring to the autumn are going to be released at once. And I know that some of us in the States are worried about new authors, debut authors, who might have come to market in a good way with a good deal of marketing behind them. At the moment, this traffic jam of new work that was delayed from the spring starts moving out in the fall, it may be much harder to introduce a debut author. Do you hear publishers worrying about this, Hugo?
Well, we are certainly a bit concerned about how the recovery phase will be, and that's also an interesting point you make, because everyone will try to release their new titles almost at the same time.
Right.
On the other hand, we are confident that we will be able to continue not life as usual. It will be the new normal, as it has been mentioned. But we're confident that we are going to be able to continue working, and we have seen the response by our main partners, but by readers as well. The response by readers has been very good as well, I think.
It's good. It's good to hear. I hope that the intensity of the recovery is something that everyone can weather. It, once again, one of the things we're talking about here is that all the sectors are going to need to work together. Not at the point that an author is looking at a book that's been delayed or even canceled. What is, so especially in the case of a cancellation, this must be devastating to an author. This means trying to find an entirely new sale, right?
Yeah, well, I think it brings with it an incredible amount of anxiety. I mean, whether it's accurate or not, there's a perception with a lot of authors, especially if it's your first book, that this is your one shot, right? And you've been working towards it for so long and doing so much preparatory work towards this one sort of launch and retail moment. And what you said, to launch into an incredibly crowded marketplace with a very distracted consumer base, I think it brings a lot of anxiety to the first-time author, for sure. But I wanted to reiterate what you were saying, Porter, about the importance of bookstores, and especially the independent bookstores. Fabian, one of the things that I've seen happening certainly within the author and reader community here in Canada is we're all exchanging bookstore gift certificates now. So we're all, in effect, investing in the sector to try to mitigate that long-term effect. So the money's going to the bookstore right now, and we're hanging on to the book certificates for when we can get back in and do our browsing. So that's...
it was very unfair for me to say that only the customers are very supportive of the bookstore, because in many countries we also see a lot of support from authors in all sorts of different ways. You know, we see authors becoming the courier, bringing their books obviously to
Yeah,
from the
yeah.
bookstore to the reader. We see online readings and interviews and all sort of events trying to replace the brick and mortar and live events that, I mean, bookstores obviously organize a lot and has become an integral part of their business. So there, I mean, I think in general, you can easily say that bookstores and authors have maybe even become closer due to Corona crisis.
Yeah, I think that's one of, I mean, let's just say there have been no good effects of a worldwide pandemic, but if you search around for something within our sector, I think the tightening of the relationships on all sides. I mean, I've had so much communication with the publishing sector since the lockdown, and so much communication with the bookselling sector. So I find that to be heartening, at least, if not overall positive, because of the context of the times.
But
It's great to hear. One of the nicest stories I think we've had recently was in France. A publisher decided to create stickers for the floor that show you how far to stand apart and everything for the bookstores to use, and to print them free of charge and provide them all a little stand for the hand sanitizer, all of the things the bookstores needed, so that they at least didn't have to go out and find their own signage and their own materials to try to guide the customer through the store. I love seeing that little bit of cooperation, and it was just simply a generous thought on the part of that publisher. Hugo, I'm sure you're in the association.
Thank you, Porter. Yeah, and I think it's really, I really do think that even in the middle of such a crisis, and it's really a tragedy to see so many infected people, so many deaths. But however, I think there are positive things like this increased collaboration. I think it's really very important. We usually have a good communication and collaboration with our authors, with booksellers, but this has been proving a very good chance to strengthen this collaboration. We, for example, at IPA signed a very important joint statement in April for World Book Day, together with authors and with booksellers, calling for governments to support their book chain in all of the different countries. And then there are a lot of examples like what you just mentioned. But for example, I don't know, we are engaging with authors, and authors are really very willing to take part in online activities with publishers. We are organizing online activities with our authors and trying to do also activities with booksellers as much as we can. Booksellers are helping also publishers by all the innovation they're doing with delivery. And there is also, now that we were mentioning some examples of collaboration, there is something I think also very positive. I mean, just one example that just came to my mind of one of our members in Colombia, the Colombian Publishers Association. They did a fundraising, the publishers in Colombia did a fundraising with readers and consumers to raise money to pay for the wages of bookstores, of the bookstores employees. And they raised a substantial amount of money among readers and consumers for the bookstores, because bookstores were going through really hard times, and they weren't sure if they were going to be able to maintain all their staff. So they did that in Colombia, just as an example of collaboration.
You know, I love that. We saw this in the United States recently when there's a large charitable effort going on right now with the Book Industry Charitable Foundation, and among the publishers trying to raise money for our bookstores. And the Book Industry Study Group did a trivia night and got everybody online doing book trivia together to raise money for a contribution to this effort for bookstores. And you're right, seeing these elements of the industry work together to support the most vulnerable and the most imperiled parts of the supply chain is fantastic. It's what we need to see. And I also like the direction you're taking us right now on some good news. in the middle of this kind of thing. John, what kind of good points can you see coming through for the authors community? Is there a silver lining that we haven't thought of yet?
Well, I mean, it's been really tricky, you know, and trying to find the silver lining is a difficult job, but I'm sure it's there. One of the things that we did very early on here in Canada is we were quite worried that authors might not fit into the government structured relief funding that was out there, because authors incomes are kind of lumpy. They come in chunks at different times of the year, and they're not as sort of logical and dependable as you know, other parts of the workforce. And so we were quite afraid that authors would not fit into the government funding. So there was a lot of lobbying that we had to do early on to sort of educate the government on how our sector works and make sure that authors qualified for relief funding. On top of that, we were really concerned about the immediate loss of income. We did a study through the Writers Union of Canada and found that on average, authors were losing immediately about $10,000 each, and the government programs weren't going to satisfy that need for sure. So we put together our own emergency relief fund with donations from the community, and that's been wonderful to see. So we've got corporate donations, we've got partnership donations, but also we had an amazing amount of individual donations from authors who are maybe better off than the rest of their colleagues and their peers. And it was extraordinarily generous and wonderful to see. So if there's a silver lining, I would say that was it.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
And looking at the bookstores sort of in the same vein of something that maybe good lessons learned, is it possible that more of our bookstore and our bookstores and our booksellers are learning to use the web and learning to use digital contact with their own customers? We've always thought of the digital sales process being limited to the platforms, but perhaps there actually has been an upturn, an increase in how much booksellers are learning to use this themselves and get the digital tools on their side for a change. Do you see this happening?
Yes, with this twist that I think that many booksellers were already relatively good up to speed, so to say. But now they have the chance to expose it more and to explore it more, and they definitely, as I said before, they see more of their customers and sometimes even a new customer base reaching out to them online. And online, we're not talking only about sales, but we're also talking about, for example, what I said before, online event streaming or other services that they explore right now. Here, obviously, our concern and our worry is this not only for this time being and for now, but how can we build on this also in the future? Because our real concern or threat would be that this corona crisis pushes a certain definite shift to the big online e-commerce giants. Not only that being a threat to the booksellers, but for example, in my country where I'm from, we recently published a study by GfK, and we see now all kinds of studies being published by the Nielsen's and GfK's from this world, because right now it's about 2-3 months of Corona crisis, so it's now they can start looking back at what's actually happening to the book sales in this Corona crisis. And what we see is that the variety of titles, and especially unknown authors and those debuts and new authors, they are really having a hard time in this shift to online. You really see that the brick and mortar store is really what we always believed and thought is the ideal environment and place to discover those new titles, those new works, to browse the serendipity. This is really where we excel as brick and mortar independent stores. So yeah, we hope this will not be lost to a certain extent due to this crisis. So hopefully there will also be a certain bounce back, and yeah, we'll have to see. We have to learn.
I think you're absolutely right. And what this brings us to, I mean, when you talk about preserving that special relationship of the bookseller and the consumer, which is on behalf of the entire industry, I think that what we have to look to next as we near some forms of recovery, different in all parts of the world, as we're saying, is the importance of the industry standing together and saying to our governments, we are here, the creative industries are important, and they must not be left out of subsidy and support programs, right? That makes sense, Hugo?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, Porter, I was thinking with all of what we have been discussing for the last few minutes that I just remembered that we had yesterday a talk by one of our authors, a neurologist, for our staff in the company, online, of course, like everything nowadays. And he was speaking about the importance of positive thinking, that even with so many problems and with so many tragedies we are facing, the importance of individual and collective positive thinking. And well, I have been thinking and trying to communicate to our community that we will overcome the crisis, that we have to be positive about this. And it really gives me good spirits and encouragement to have a conversation like this with our partners in the business, with authors, with booksellers, seeing every day how many examples there are of authors and publishers and booksellers doing stuff to help their communities as well. And that makes me really feel proud of being part of this book chain.
It's a wonderful note to end on. We're at the end of our time, but I love what you're saying, Hugo. We are actually in this together. As we have said many times to people, but in this industry in particular, it's great to see so many parts of it pulling together so well. That's great. Thank you, Hugo Setzer, Fabian Pogman, and John Deegan. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate the International Publishers Association having us and giving us this chance to talk together. And thanks to our audience who's been listening to us. Good to have you with us. Thanks so much.
Porter.
Thank you, Porter.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Porter.
Good to see you, Hugo and Fabian.
Likewise. Thank you, John and Fabian. Porter, thank you. Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.